No one in Redwood Bluffs expected the night to unfold like it did. The community sat perched on a quiet hillside, its rows of identical two-story houses reflecting the cautious uniformity preferred by its homeowners association. Streetlights glowed with warm, amber hues, and the distant hum of sprinklers offered a reassuring background noise for restless sleepers. It was the kind of neighborhood where an occasional burnt-out porch light or a slightly unkempt lawn were the biggest sources of drama, which made the events of that spring evening all the more shocking. At precisely 2:14 a.m., an emergency call roused the local police station. A resident, awakened by a strange clamor at her back window, believed someone was trying to break in. The responding unit was Officer Ricardo Delgado, a dedicated lawman who had only recently been assigned to the Redwood Bluffs area. He'd been on the force for nearly a decade, gaining a reputation for de-escalating tense situations without resorting to force. In his squad car that night, he expected nothing more than a routine check, an overblown animal disturbance, or perhaps a door not properly locked. But Redwood Bluffs had its own private security, and as it turned out, the security guard was taking his job very seriously. Too seriously, some would later say. August Gus Trent was a name that sparked polarized opinions in Redwood Bluffs. Some neighbors admired his diligence, while others whispered he was wound too tight. A former Marine with a tall, lean frame, he was hired by the Homeowners Association after a series of petty theft had unsettled the community. Most of the crimes involved stolen lawn ornaments or rummaged through mailboxes, but the HOA decided it warranted a near-militaristic response. They posted Gus at the main gate, handed him a shiny new taser and a set of radios, and gave him the final say on who could set foot in Redwood Bluffs after dusk. On that fateful night, Gus was patrolling the perimeter in the association's golf cart, a small but sturdy vehicle that he'd fitted with flashing orange lights. He wore the standard navy blue uniform, but pinned on his chest was a row of medals from his time in service. Although Redwood Bluffs' quiet sidewalks didn't resemble the high-stakes terrain he'd known in the military, his mind continued to linger in a state of constant readiness. Perhaps it was force of habit, or maybe it was something deeper, a lingering restlessness he could never quite put to bed. When Gus received the same call that dispatch sent to the police, his pulse ticked up. The voice on the other end of his radio described a possible break-in at Redwood Bluffs Lane, house number 47, an older couple's place that had been meticulously maintained. Gus immediately made for the address, the glow of the golf cart's orange light splaying across the manicured lawns as he rolled down the moonlit street. Meanwhile, Officer Delgado arrived in his cruiser moments later. He noticed the minimal signs of disturbance, a partially open gate, an overturned potted plant, but nothing that screamed robbery. Still, protocol demanded thoroughness, so he parked discreetly, headlights off, wanting to avoid alerting any lurking suspect. As Delgado exited his vehicle, a rustle came from around the side of the house. He moved quietly toward the noise, senses sharpened. He was used to the hush of these small suburban communities, where a single dog's bark could travel down an entire block. Another faint sound reached him, something brushing against the window. Delgado carefully gripped his flashlight and took another step. Suddenly, a bright beam cut across the side yard. Delgado froze. It came from another flashlight, trained firmly on him. Behind the light, he could make out a tall figure in a dark uniform. The voice that cut through the hush was firm, taut with authority. "Police?" the figure asked, though there was little warmth in the question. "Officer Delgado, Redwood PD," Delgado replied, squinting at the brightness. "Mind pointing that thing somewhere else?" The other man didn't budge. The beam locked on Delgado's chest. "Badge," came the brisk demand. Delgado lifted one hand to produce his police ID, a slight flicker of annoyance crossing his face. He'd had run-ins with overzealous private security before, but the ones in Redwood Bluffs were usually more laid back. This was, after all, a low-crime area with a population that skewed older. "I'm responding to a possible break-in," Delgado said calmly, making sure to speak in a measured tone. "Are you the homeowner's security?" "I'm head of security," the man corrected him. "August Trent. Most folks call me Gus." If Delgado found that statement amusing, he didn't show it. "All right, Gus," he said, ID extended forward. "We're on the same team. Let's handle this quietly, okay?" Gus leaned in, scanning the ID with methodical caution. He lowered his flashlight, but his shoulders remained tense. "It's unusual for the police to arrive without letting me know first," Gus murmured, as if Redwood Bluffs were its own sovereign territory. Delgado, who typically prided himself on patience, felt a twinge of exasperation. 911 call came in," he explained. "We respond. That's how it works. No sign of forced entry, but let's circle the perimeter and check." The homeowners inside, probably scared. The uninvited notion of stepping aside for the actual police seemed to rest poorly with Gus. He gave a short nod, but the tension didn't leave his posture. Officer Delgado switched on his flashlight, heading down the narrow path toward the back of the house. Gus followed, scanning every inch of the yard. Somewhere in the darkness, a shape flickered, possibly the intruder. Delgado lifted a hand to indicate he'd noticed movement near the fence. That's when something happened no one could fully explain afterward. Gus's instincts and Delgado's approach to policing clashed in a sudden eruption. A rustle, a glimpse of movement, and a quick, tense miscommunication about who was who. Gus felt threatened in that split second. He would later swear he saw someone raise an arm, possibly holding a weapon. A loud crackling sounded. Bright pronged wires shot through the air. Officer Delgado jerked, the taser's electric current contorting his body. He dropped to one knee, confusion and shock flaring in his eyes. Somewhere nearby, a stray dog barked, as if startled by the spectacle. Above them, the moon glowed softly, and in Redwood Bluffs, a single porch light flicked on, revealing neighbors peeking from their windows, awakened to a sight they never expected. The community's own security guard having tossed a police officer, all in the name of protecting their tidy suburb from a phantom thief. The moment Officer Delgado hit the ground, a shocked hush fell over the yard, broken only by the buzzing hum of the taser winding down. Gus stood there, the device still gripped tight in his hand, disbelief spreading across his face. He was trained, yes, militarily trained, in fact, but he was supposed to be above panic. Delgado, still trembling, struggled to speak. His limbs felt like lead, his nerves protesting every movement. Adrenaline spiked in his blood. He'd dealt with tense calls before, but never in his wildest dreams did he expect to be tossed by a private security guard in a quiet suburb. Gradually, Gus realized what he'd done. He let the taser slip from his grasp, the wires still trailing across the short grass. Officer, are you?" He stepped forward, reaching for Delgado, who was gasping for breath, his face twisted in pain. A single bright light clicked on from a neighboring house, then another. Windows creaked open. Voices, muffled, urgent, floated through the crisp night air. An elderly neighbor, Ms. Peterson, shouted something about calling for help. A younger man, clad in pajamas and slippers, hurried into his driveway, phone in hand. Delgado finally found his voice, though it was weak. "Get away from me," he managed, trying to gather himself. Gus instinctively raised his hands, palms out, as though approaching a frightened animal. "I'm sorry," he said, sounding more desperate than apologetic. "I thought there was movement." He tried to rationalize the inexplicable, but the damage was done. Delgado was now an injured officer in need of assistance. Within minutes, the small suburban street came alive. People poured out onto their porches, drawn by the flashing lights of Delgado's cruiser and the swirl of confusion. Someone had dialed 911 again, this time to report an officer down. Gus, toggling his radio, tried to contact the security office he nominally reported to. But the lines were jammed with frantic chatter, confusion about the robbery suspect, the tossed cop, and the heightened tension that was now gripping Redwood Bluffs. Delgado, teeth clenched, finally got to his feet, though his body wobbled under the residual shock. A wave of anger contorted his features. He was a professional, a man who believed in calm communication. But at that moment, all he felt was betrayal, attacked in the line of duty by someone claiming to be on the same side of law and order. He reached for his own radio to call dispatch, voice shaking. Officer Delgado, I've been assaulted by private security. Need medical. No visual on suspect at the moment. That last part carried a heavy weight. The alleged intruder was still out there somewhere. If, in fact, there was a real intruder at all. Right now, Delgado's mind churned with questions. Was the break-in call even legitimate, or some kind of hoax? Either way, Redwood Bluffs might have turned from a routine burglary response into a fiasco with professional repercussions. Gus hovered close, eyes flickering around like he expected condemnation from every direction. When backup arrived, another squad car, an ambulance, plus 2 more officers, Gus felt a stone in his gut. This was no longer a misunderstanding that could be smoothed over with an apology. He was in trouble, possibly serious legal trouble. The paramedics rushed to Delgado, who insisted, I'm all right. My muscles are stiff, that's all. But he winced as they guided him sit on the edge of the ambulance's open doors. Bright white lights illuminated the yard, which no longer seemed peaceful. Yellow caution tape was strung around the property line, marking a potential crime scene. Neighbors clumped together, hushed and wide-eyed. Redwood Bluffs rarely saw police tape or ambulances. Tonight felt like the calm veneer of suburban life had been peeled away, exposing raw nerves and seething tensions. The newly arrived officers pulled Gus aside. Officer Carmen Wilkes, a stout woman with close-cropped hair and a no-nonsense expression, took Gus's statement while another officer questioned Delgado. Meanwhile, the paramedics checked Delgado's vitals, bandaging the small punctures on his chest where the taser barbs had hit. You deployed your taser because you perceived a threat, Wilkes repeated, pen scratching across her notepad. But you didn't confirm it was Officer Delgado. Gus struggled for a coherent explanation, but it only sounded more muddled each time he replayed the moment in his head. I saw movement in the shadows, he said, voice catching in his throat. I just reacted. It was dark. I'd identified myself. He identified himself. But something spooked me. Wilkes gave him a pointed look. You realize how serious this is? You effectively assaulted a peace officer. That's no small matter. Sweat dampened Gus's brow. He glanced around, seeing the crowd of onlookers. Some recognized him. Others only saw a uniform that did not match the police, associating him with this bizarre chain of events. The HOA that hired him was nowhere to be found at this hour, though rumor had it the HOA president, a man named Fletcher Barnes, had been woken and was on his way. In the corners of the taped-off yard, something shifted. One of the officers, scanning with a flashlight, paused. Over here, he called out. Tracks near this fence. Fresh footprints. Looks like someone hopped over. So the intruder was real. And if the footprints were any clue, they might have gotten away. The notion unleashed a wave of renewed tension among the assembled officers. That meant Redwood Bluffs still had a burglar in its midst, or at the very least, a prowler who had fled the scene after seeing official lights. As Delgado was helped to his feet, he locked eyes with Gus. There, in the swirl of emergency lights, the 2 men, both tasked with protecting a community, faced each other. Delgado's stare radiated anger and disbelief. Gus looked shell-shocked, like a man who realized he'd just made the mistake of a lifetime. You're off this property, Delgado said, voice still shaking but firm. You or your boss will be hearing from us. This is assault. I should cuff you right now. Officer Wilkes stepped in, urging Delgado to stay calm as the paramedics guided him back to the ambulance for a final check. Gus stood mute, not quite sure how to respond, as if his usual bravado had been stripped away. One by one, neighbors were escorted back to their houses, told to lock their doors. The swirling lights slowly faded as the second police unit eased out of the neighborhood in search of the suspect. Delgado stayed behind just long enough to finish his own official statement, still rubbing the stiff muscles in his arms. He glared at Gus, who was standing a few feet away, uncertain of where to go or what to do. When a night finally settled down, Redwood Bluffs was left with more questions than answers. A security guard who'd overstepped his bounds, a police officer nursing an injured pride and a pair of taser burns, and the real suspect slipping away into the darkness. Morning in Redwood Bluffs brought a semblance of normalcy, or tried to. Sunrise bathed the cul-de-sacs in a mellow glow, and the hum of lawnmowers resumed as some residents woke early to keep their properties immaculate. But the events of the previous night clung to every doorstep like morning dew. Word spread fast in an HOA-governed community where rumor and speculation were second nature. The crackling tension that accompanied dawn was so thick it could be felt in the air. Parents hustled their children into cars more urgently than usual, worried eyes scanning for any sign of the unknown burglar who had eluded police. Meanwhile, whispers about the tasing incident took on new life. Some neighbors gossiped that Gus had gone rogue. Others speculated Delgado had botched the operation, failing to properly identify himself. Depending on whom you asked, one was the villain and the other the victim. Fletcher Barnes, the HOA president, called an emergency meeting at the community clubhouse that afternoon. The clubhouse, usually the site of crafts fairs or low-stakes bingo nights, felt suddenly transformed into a makeshift war room. There was an underlying sense of dread as concerned residents filed in. Rows of chairs filled up fast, and the air conditioning struggled against the heat of so many bodies. Gus was seated near the front, in a plain polo shirt rather than his security uniform. His posture was rigid, as if he was bracing for an attack from all sides. The seat next to him remained empty. No family by his side, no friend to give moral support. A few rows back, Miss Peterson peered at him with pity, while others observed with stern disapproval. At precisely 3 p.m., Fletcher Barnes stepped up to the lectern. He was an older man, but sharp-eyed and meticulously groomed, the sort who pressed his trousers to a knife's edge. He cleared his throat, tapping the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen of Redwood Bluffs," he began, "I appreciate you coming on such short notice. I know last night was, well, it was beyond troubling. We've prided ourselves on safety and order. Now we must address what happened and figure out a path forward." A murmur rippled through the crowd as cameras flashed. A local reporter, having sniffed out the story, had shown up, camera in hand, notepad at the ready. This small suburb rarely landed in headlines, but a security guard tossing a police officer was big news indeed. Barnes mentioned the outstanding search for the suspected prowler, urging neighbors to remain vigilant. He reported that Redwood PD would be increasing patrols for the time being. Then he sighed, leaning into the microphone. "As for our own security arrangement, we hired Mr. August Trent to protect this community. Unfortunately, an incident transpired. Officer Delgado was harmed. While we investigate, Mr. Trent has been placed on administrative leave." That last line landed with a thud in Gus's chest. Sure, he expected consequences, but hearing it stated so bluntly and so publicly stung him like a wasp. Barnes continued without meeting Gus's eyes. "We'll cooperate fully with law enforcement's investigation. I want to make it clear that Redwood Bluffs is a law-abiding community, and we respect our men and women in blue. We also want to ensure Mr. Trent receives due process. But for now, his access to Redwood Bluff security resources is suspended." A wave of hushed commentary passed through the audience. Gus clenched his jaw, fighting the urge to defend himself. But what would he say? That he was spooked by a shadow? That he, a trained ex-Marine, had somehow lost his composure because a police officer startled him? There was no easy explanation. Barnes went on to address the membership, urging them to comply with any new policies the HOA might enact, potentially including more cameras, new gate codes, and even nightly curfews. By the time he finished, the meeting devolved into a chorus of anxious questions. What if the prowler comes back? Is Delgado pressing charges? Could we sue the HOA for failing to protect us? Gus slipped out of his seat, ducking away from the crowds. He made for the double doors leading outside, flinching at the bright afternoon light. Each step felt like a betrayal. He'd come to Redwood Bluffs with the sincere intention to protect these people, and now he was the centerpiece of a fiasco. As he stepped into the parking lot, a voice called out, "Gus!" "Hey!" He turned to see Ms. Peterson hobble toward him, her cane tapping the pavement. She was in her early 70s, with kind eyes behind thick glasses. I just wanted to say," she began, a bit breathless, "I know you didn't do this on purpose. Gus felt an unexpected surge of gratitude at her words. "Thank you," he said quietly, "but I can't imagine how it looks, or how Officer Delgado feels." She gave him a solemn nod. "The neighborhood is scared, but we know you've always been devoted to our safety. I do hope everything sorts itself out. Please take care." With that, she turned and began her slow walk back to the clubhouse. Gus stood there for a moment, uncertain of where to go next. He no longer had authority here. He didn't have much of a home to retreat to. He rented a small place in a nearby town. He'd spent more time patrolling Redwood Bluffs than actually living his own life. Meanwhile, across town at the police station, Officer Delgado sat in a windowless room for a debrief with his supervising sergeant. He felt numb, an ice pack on the back of his neck. The taser marks stung every time he moved. "What's the story, Delgado?" the sergeant asked, peering over a folder of notes. "HQ's not thrilled about this. We've got to give an official statement to the press. And then there's the matter of charges against that security guard, Trent, right?" Delgado sighed heavily. He didn't relish the idea of pushing for the man's arrest. He recognized fear or confusion might have been at play. But the blow to his pride, not to mention the literal blow of electricity that still made his muscles sore, was tough to swallow. "Look," he began, choosing his words carefully. "The guy's ex-military. He seemed jumpy, paranoid. Maybe he truly thought I was the prowler. He claimed he saw a weapon. I didn't have my gun drawn. It was holstered. I don't know what got into him." The sergeant raised an eyebrow. "You're saying you might not press charges?" Delgado paused. Emotions churned. Part of him wanted to see Gus held accountable. Another part felt reluctant to end a man's career or tarnish his record for a mistake, albeit a disastrous one. "I'll cooperate with the investigation," Delgado finally said. "Let the system decide. Meanwhile, we still have that actual burglar to worry about." The sergeant nodded. "We do. And the media circus around Redwood Bluffs is just getting started. I'm assigning 2 more patrols there. We can't have vigilante tactics messing up legitimate police work." Delgado agreed, though inside he couldn't shake his anger. The memory of hitting the ground, the surge of electrical current, replayed in his mind every time he blinked. By evening, Redwood Bluffs was once again on edge, police cruisers making a show of presence along the neatly manicured streets. Behind drawn blinds, neighbors traded theories and blame. The HOA phone line rang off the hook. And in a small one-bedroom apartment a few miles away, Gus Trent stared at his reflection in the bathroom mirror, wrestling with the question that had haunted him since the moment he pressed the taser's trigger. How could he, a man with discipline and training, have made such a fateful mistake? By the end of the week, Redwood Bluffs was awash in rumor. Local news reporters staked out the neighborhood gates, filming segments about the suburban standoff when security overstepped. Some neighbors hinted that the prowler was just a figment of someone's imagination. Others insisted they'd seen suspicious figures lurking around. Meanwhile, the police stepped up patrols, trailing slowly up and down the freshly paved roads. Officer Delgado, cleared by the department physician for light duty, found himself spending long hours near Redwood Bluffs. He'd park his cruiser under the shade of an ancient oak, watching the quiet houses with a wary eye. Every now and then, he'd catch a glimpse of the front gate, where private security used to patrol. Not anymore, at least not in the same capacity. The HOA, chastened by the fiasco, had replaced Gus's position with rotating temp guards who mostly waved at incoming cars. Delgado could still feel phantom jolts of the taser in his muscles, as though his body refused to forget the trauma. Each time he recalled that crackling shock, his stomach twisted. He wanted closure, but Redwood Bluffs seemed determined to supply only more questions. One early afternoon, he stepped out of his cruiser to stretch his legs. In the distance, he noticed a figure walking slowly along the outer fence of Redwood Bluffs. Hat pulled low, shoulders hunched, the figure studied the perimeter as though looking for weaknesses. Delgado's instincts kicked in. He approached on foot, stepping quietly. The figure, tall, lanky, and male, raised his head at Delgado's approach. Delgado recognized him immediately, Gus. The former security guard wore a plain jacket, hands shoved into the pockets. He acknowledged Delgado with a single nod, a swirl of guilt and uncertainty etched on his face. "What are you doing here, Gus?" Delgado asked, voice level. Gus cleared his throat. "I've been trying to see if there's any sign of the prowler. I keep hearing that Redwood PD hasn't found him yet." Delgado frowned. "We're handling it, or at least trying to. This is still our jurisdiction, you know. You realize you shouldn't be skulking around." Gus's face tightened. "I'm not skulking. I'm worried about those folks. I was hired to protect them, and I messed up big time. But they're not safe if that guy's still out there." For a moment, an awkward silence hung between them. Delgado's mind ping-ponged between empathy and the memory of how it felt to be tossed. Finally, he sighed. "Look, I get that you want to help. But do you really think hanging around is going to make things better? Half the residents probably blame you for what happened." Gus stared at the fence, eyes distant. "I know, but Ms. Peterson, an elderly woman in there, she's got no family nearby, except a niece who visits once a month. If that burglar decides to break in again, who's watching her? Your guys patrol once an hour if she's lucky." Delgado crossed his arms. Gus had a point. Although Redwood Bluffs was relatively safe, there was a breach in sense of security, and the alleged prowler's footprints proved someone had been there that night. But Delgado also had a job to do. He couldn't just let Gus slip back into a vigilante role. He spoke more gently. "I can't let you go in there playing hero. You've done enough damage. The department is still reviewing your case. Whether I press charges or not might matter less than you think. The DA could file on their own if they see fit." Gus's jaw clenched. "I know. I'm not armed or anything. Just wanted to see if there's any way I can help. If you hear anything, like a clue about who this intruder is, let me know." Delgado shook his head. "That's not how it works. My best advice? Stay away until the investigation's wrapped. It could go easier on you if you keep a low profile. Also, you're on private property lines here. They can arrest you for trespassing." Gus nodded, as though accepting a reality he wished he could change. He took a step back. "All right, officer," he said quietly. "I'll go." Delgado watched Gus walk away, disappearing around the corner of a tall hedge. A pang of pity twisted in Delgado's chest. Part of him recognized that Gus's guilt was sincere, but the law was the law. Everyone had to face consequences, no matter their intentions. That evening, fate intervened. A call crackled over Delgado's radio. Possible suspicious activity near Redwood Bluffs Lane. Caller reports seeing a man climbing a fence. Backup requested. Delgado's pulse quickened. He revved the cruiser's engine, lights flashing as he headed to the same street where the fiasco had begun. He arrived to find an older man standing in his backyard, anxiously pointing toward a line of shrubs. He was tall, wore a baseball cap, the man said breathlessly. "Took off that way." Delgado signaled for backup and jogged around the side of the house. Motion sensor lights flared, revealing footprints in the flower bed. Beyond that, a section of fence had a broken slat, freshly cracked. Delgado scaled it, dropping into a narrow alley running behind the properties. A shape darted ahead, barely visible under the faint glow of a distant street lamp. Delgado gave chase, heart thudding. The figure was quick, weaving between garbage bins and leaping over low fences. Delgado cursed under his breath, radioing in. "Suspect heading north, behind Redwood Bluffs Lane." Suddenly, a tall form materialized near the suspect's path. A shout rang out, followed by the sound of scuffle. As Delgado caught up, he saw the intruder, clad in dark clothes, grappling with none other than Gus. The ex-security guard must have arrived on foot when he heard the sirens. The intruder threw a wild punch, knocking Gus backward. Delgado lunged, tackling the suspect just as they tried to bolt past. They all fell in a heap, adrenaline spiking. From somewhere in the distance, Delgado heard more police sirens closing in. The suspect flailed, but Delgado and Gus pinned him to the ground, their combined weight overpowering the struggling figure. Delgado snapped handcuffs onto the suspect's wrists, then quickly patted him down. A small pocket knife clattered to the pavement. Gasping for breath, Delgado rolled off the suspect, one knee still pressed against the man's back. Gus, breathing heavily, scrambled upright. They locked eyes for a second, both remembering the last time they'd met in the dark. Within moments, more officers arrived, weapons drawn. Delgado showed his badge, and they secured the suspect, who glared at everyone with furious eyes. In the bright glare of flashlights, Delgado recognized the face, a known petty criminal who frequented suburban areas looking for easy break-ins. One officer knelt beside Delgado. "You good?" Delgado nodded, inhaling raggedly. Yeah, I'm good." He looked at Gus. "Nice timing." Gus offered a grim nod. "Guess I'm not fired from public service just yet." There was a flicker of mutual respect. The very man Delgado could have had arrested for assault had just helped apprehend the prowler. As paramedics arrived to check them for injuries, Delgado found himself wondering if, in a twisted way, Redwood Bluffs might have found the hero it never asked for, albeit one who had made a colossal mistake. A week later, Redwood Bluffs found itself healing from the drama that had shaken its tranquil facade. The prowler, identified as a small-time thief named Reggie Hall, confessed to multiple break-ins across the county. He'd used Redwood Bluffs as a target due to his perception as an easy mark. Older residents, homes full of valuables, and a security force he thought would be minimal. Officer Delgado, after the chase and arrest, was hailed by many residents as the neighborhood savior. They stopped by his patrol car with homemade cookies and grateful smiles, praising him for doing his duty so effectively. Some even apologized on Gus's behalf, though Delgado would politely wave them off. He never publicly badmouthed Gus. Although the tasing incident still stung, both physically and emotionally, Delgado recognized that the bigger threat was behind bars. As for Gus, the district attorney considered pressing charges but ultimately declined. Witness statements described the nighttime confusion, and Delgado, when asked, chose not to push the matter to the fullest extent. Police body cam footage supported the narrative that Gus genuinely, if mistakenly, believed there was an imminent threat. Coupled with Gus's military record, it was enough to avoid serious legal repercussions. Nevertheless, Gus's contract with Redwood Bluffs was terminated. The HOA board cited a loss of trust. Fletcher Barnes released a statement wishing Gus well, but stating the community would not be comfortable reinstating him. Redwood Bluffs hired a new private security firm, well-established with multiple guards and a direct line to local law enforcement. At first, Gus avoided the neighborhood. He knew he was an uncomfortable reminder of a serious mishap. However, Ms. Peterson reached out, inviting him to her home for tea. He accepted, albeit reluctantly. Stepping back into Redwood Bluffs felt surreal. The tidy lawns looked the same, but he felt like a stranger, the eyes of neighbors occasionally peering from behind curtains. Ms. Peterson greeted him with a warm smile and a plate of shortbread cookies. She pointed to the swirl of camera crews that had once clogged the entrance. "They're gone, finally," she said, pouring tea into 2 delicate cups. "But the memory remains." Fletcher Barnes hasn't stopped talking about new gates and motion sensors. Gus settled into a floral armchair. "I guess that's a good thing," he said quietly, "if it keeps you all safe." She studied him for a moment. "You know, I've watched you patrol this community late at night, checking on folks who forgot to lock up. You would stop and chat with some of us. You always seem to care about more than just a paycheck." His gaze fell. "I did care, but one mistake, it undid everything." Ms. Peterson reached across to pat his arm. "You made a big mistake, sure, but you also helped stop that burglar. I heard about your role in the arrest. You may not be Redwood Bluffs' official guard anymore, but you still did your duty in a roundabout way." Her words offered a small comfort, but Gus still felt the ache of regret. He'd wanted to prove himself, to transition from military life to civilian security work with honor. Now, he was unemployed, his reputation tarnished in the very community he'd hoped to protect. 2 days later, Gus was picking up groceries when he spotted Delgado by chance in the parking lot. The officer was returning a shopping cart, moving with an unhurried gait. Neither man tried to avoid the other. Instead, they locked eyes, each uncertain how the conversation would go. Finally, Delgado broke the silence with a slight nod. "Hey, Gus." "Officer," Gus acknowledged. "How are you feeling?" Delgado shrugged lightly. "Occasionally get a twinge from where the taser hit me, but I'm fine." Thanks for asking. He studied Gus's face. Heard you were cleared of charges. Gus nodded. Yeah, I'm grateful you didn't push for more. I don't blame you if you resent me. Delgado took a moment before responding. I was angry. Still am, sometimes. But you also helped me take down that prowler. I guess mistakes happen, though you picked one heck of time and place. Look, I'm not here to sugarcoat anything, but I figure we can at least talk without all that tension. A cautious relief flickered in Gus's expression. I appreciate that. Any idea what you'll do next? Delgado asked. A half-smile curled on Gus's lips, tinged with uncertainty. I've been looking at jobs. Maybe some other security position, or maybe I'll go in a different direction altogether. Not sure, but I want to stay in law enforcement in some capacity, if they'll have me. Delgado rested a hand on the shopping cart, the sun glinting off the hood of his patrol car behind him. Word of advice, get some counseling. Nothing shameful about it. Transitioning from the military can leave folks on edge. Maybe that contributed to what happened. If you can get your mind right, I think you'd do just fine. Gus looked momentarily taken aback, but he slowly nodded. I'll think about it, officer. Before parting ways, Delgado offered a small olive branch. And if you ever need a reference for a new job, assuming it's not as a private security guard in Redwood Bluffs, hit me up. I can't promise a glowing endorsement, but I can at least say you're a man who made a mistake and tried to set it right. A curious gratitude lit Gus's face. That means a lot. Thank you. They shook hands, an unspoken agreement to let the past fade. Maybe not forgotten, but no longer an open wound. In that moment, Redwood Bluffs was just another suburban community under the bright midday sun, the drama slipping quietly into local lore. In the weeks that followed, Redwood Bluffs returned to its routine. Garden clubs, power washing driveways, and petty debates over fence heights. Residents still occasionally referenced the taser incident, but it became more of a cautionary tale than a point of hostility. The new security firm established a direct line to the police department, and future calls were handled with better coordination. Officer Delgado continued his patrols, forging a respectful rapport with the neighbors. He no longer felt an uneasy pinch in his gut when he passed the spot where he'd been tossed. Time had smoothed the edges of that memory. Gus landed a job at a larger security company downtown, one that handled corporate buildings. He underwent additional de-escalation training, acknowledging he could always learn more. On quiet nights, he sometimes thought about Redwood Bluffs, the place that had given him a chance, taught him a harsh lesson, and eventually saw him redeem himself by aiding in the capture of the prowler. Sometimes he'd drive by Ms. Peterson Street, just to see her lights on, a comforting beacon. He never again donned a uniform in Redwood Bluffs, but he understood that one moment of panic didn't have to define his entire life. Through adversity, he found humility, a fresh perspective on what it truly means to protect and serve. Thus, life moved on in Redwood Bluffs. The lawns remained as pristine as ever, dotted with blooming azaleas. Porch lights glowed at dusk like tiny watchful eyes, and somewhere in the distance, the echo of that taser's electric crackle became less a wound and more a whispered reminder that even in the safest communities, human flaws and redemptions find their stage. The end.